Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Here we are in the course on fundamental principles in Catholic bioethics, and then the Master of Science in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, send forth your Spirit, and we shall be recreated. You shall renew the face of the earth. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay, before the lecture itself, if there are any questions or comments from previous lectures or anything in the program. Some of you are sending me your hours by Friday night, but some of you are not sending me your hours by Friday night. So do that, please. The spreadsheet that I send you. Okay, keep it updated on a weekly basis. Even if you don't do any weeks that particular week, any hours, send it to me so that I can keep a record, all right? And it's also a reminder for you too to keep up with the internship hours. Any question or comments on that? All right, it's about engaging other people in bioethical talks, bioethical issues, right? So it's a broad range there. Any other question or comment? I hear none. All right, so I'm going to move forward then. Let's see, I have some homeworks here, but it's Kendall. All right, there she comes in person. Okay, so let's move forward. You know that the first half of this course is mostly looking at the process of evolution. And in the second half, or the second part, is not exactly equal number of lectures. We're going to dovetail in the issue of creation, and especially focusing on the biblical narrative of creation in the first chapter, the first couple of chapters of the book of Genesis. All right, so we're still more on the biological part of things here, again, to understand the facts, because biology and nature has a way of grounding us on reality, right? A reality that is independent of us. In other words, nature was here before we were here, before we were born or conceived. And hopefully nature will continue here even after we die and pass away. Right? So it's a reality that exists independent of us. In fact, we are part of that nature. When we come into existence into the world, necessarily we have to plug into the niche of our nature, right? The niche is our place in the world and the universe, which is human nature, all right? And we live according to our human nature, and that's what is expected of us, to be human while we are here. So you see that we also have a natural biological dimension to us, which we can almost summarize in a word, which is metabolism. And it certainly can be measured and is measured. And all those measurements are the basis of the practice of medicine, for example, which, by the way, medicine goes against the process of selection. I'll be talking about selection today as a follow-up from the 4 fundamental forces that drive evolution. Evolution as the possibility of the emergence of new species from previous species, right? So there's that little phrase, there are a number of catchphrases that come from Darwin or Darwinians, which is descent with modification. Think about that for a moment. Reflect on those 3 words. Descent with modification. We, for example, are immediately descendants of whom? Of our parents, biologically, right? We are descendants with the progeny of our parents, and our parents are descendants of their parents, which are our grandparents. And you notice that there's a branching effect. If we go up in the phylogeny, there's a branching effect of individuals. So it took 2 individuals to make each one of us. And it took two individuals to make each one of our parents, and so on and so forth. So you see the argument going up, there's a branching effect. Okay. However, going down, there's also a branching effect, but the branching effect going from generation to generation downward with the clock moving forward, right? It's also branching, but it's not branching. It is branching at the individual level, and it's also branching at the population level. For example, any one of us may generate more than one child. So there is a branching there. And generally, that's the standard. In fact, replacement, what is known as replacement level for the human is 1.7 children. Now, of course, it's impossible to have a 0.7 child, right? How do you have a 0.7 child? It's a statistical thing. So it means that on average, some people have one child, some people have two children, some couples have one child, some couples have two children, some couples have three children. And the average, the overall average for the entire human population, the 8 billion of us, is 1.7 average of the progeny. That's what it takes to be at a steady state. In other words, that the number of individuals being born is the same number approximately as the number of individuals who are dying at the end of their life, whether it's longevity or prematurely, whatever. But that death event, which is a radical event of the stop of life, right? There has to be a replacement level, and that is what we would call a steady state. The steady state is not static, it's dynamic, because new individuals are coming into the population. I'm talking about the global population, and new and old individuals or some individuals are getting off the population, getting off the bus, right? And so it's a steady state, it's dynamic, but it is the growth curve at that point is horizontal. Remember, it's still on the log phase. At the global population level, it's still on the log. In other words, did we cover the sigmoid population growth curve yet? Have we covered population growth curve? Yeah, we did previously. Sigmoid, let's see, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, so we're talking about normal distribution. Yes, okay, that may be coming up a little bit more in when we talk about population. But let's bring it up since I'm just warming up the engines here intellectually. Population growth curve. This is the standard growth curve for any population in principle, in general. This is a more realistic one here with the wobble. This curve is called a population growth curve. It's also called a sigmoid curve because when you think of an S shape, think of a capital letter S or even lowercase s, it's the same wiggle, right? Then pull from the two ends. Pull from two ends and stretch it out, and you see that you get this kind of curve or this kind of shape. If you pull an S from its two ends, its two tails, right? And S in Greek is sigmoid, sigma, the letter sigma. And so this is what it looks like. This is called a sigmoid curve or population growth curve. And it has basically 4 stages, of which only 3 are shown here. All right, only 3 are shown. The first phase, which is called the lag phase, L-A-G. The second phase, which is called a log phase, L-O-G. And then the third phase, which is called the stationary phase. And then with limited resources, what can happen over a long period of time is a decline phase, which would be the end here, curving down, downhill, going down into a crash, all right? That means extinction. Now, this is done for individuals of a species, for each species. And each species has what is known as the carrying capacity. There it is. Carrying capacity is the dashed line and is represented as capital K. carrying capacity. Let's think about this for a moment. What is on the x-axis? Define the axis. Time or number of generations, you know, a passage of time, all right? Or it could be also number of generations, but basically it's, remember on the x-axis, we always have the independent variable, right? And the independent variable generally is time or some other thing like that. It could be temperature, etc. But it's some factor over which we have no control that happens independently, whether we realize it or not, whether we understand it or accept it or not. Time has already passed since the beginning of the lecture, inexorably, whether we like it or not. All right, so we're moving forward in time, and we have divided time chronologically into discrete amounts, which could be a unit of time, could be a second or a minute or an hour or a day or a year or a century or a millennium or any amount of time that we give, right? It could also be in millions of years. So you can see the scale can be from the very small to the very large. But it's chronological. In other words, every second is identical to every other second insofar as size or measurement. All right, so that's the independent variable. Now, how about the y-axis is the dependent variable? In other words, the key question is, what is changing according to the independent variable? Whatever we're measuring, okay? So what is changing is, for example, population size. So this would be, what are the units of population size? Right, whatever species, basically the species, all right? But it would be individuals within that species, actual individuals. Now, individuals are whole numbers. There's no fragment of an individual, because a fragment of an individual is a dead individual, is not living, right? So this is considered living individuals. And typically it's also after birth or hatching or germinating, right? Moving forward in life, this number of individuals. And so we start measuring at time 0 at the beginning. And this would be any individual, any species on Earth follows generally this pattern of growth. We start with few individuals. Let's say we start with just a couple. It could be a couple of moles, or it could be a couple of insects, male and female. They also reproduce sexually. Or if it's asexual, it could be one bacterium that is going to split into two, right? But the important thing is that the first part of the curve, this first part, is very slow growing. And that's why it's called lag, L-A-G. It lags, it goes slowly. Think of, for example, of the growth curve of bacteria, which is very simplistic. One bacterium divides into two through the simple process of cell division. And now we have two bacteria. Each one of those two divides into two more, right? So every generation, we double the population. So let's do that just mentally. From 1, how many do we get? 2 after 2, next generation. 4, next generation. 8, not 6, but 8. And the next generation, 16, and the next one, 32. So you see, in 5 generations, we have 32 bacteria in 5 generations. All right, let's go forward. 6th generation, 32, 64, next generation, 128, right? Just duplicate 64, 128 double, 220, 56, 256. Let's try to go to 10. 256, 5, 256. So we got 6 left out, 12, 512, 512, 10 generations, double of 512. And 24, 1,024, right? So imagine this, in 10 generations, right? 10 generations, we have gone from one bacterium to 1,000 bacteria. And the next generation is 2,000 bacteria, and the next generation is 4,000 bacteria with an extra, and the next one is 8, 16, they repeat again, but in the thousands with an extra, right? So in very few generations, we get a huge amount of individuals just by mitosis or binary fission, just by splitting. Now imagine if the progeny is more than 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And the typical in animals and plants is thousands. For example, one fish will lay out how many eggs? Thousands of eggs. And then the male will lay out millions of sperm and fertilize the eggs. It's called smelt in fish. And then the majority of those eggs will be fertilized, but the majority of those eggs will not survive. Will not survive because they'll become food for other fish and other creatures of the oceans and the lakes and ponds, etc. All right. So I'm getting kind of ahead here, but that's going to be one of the observations of Darwin's observations for the theory of evolution, the overabundance of progeny. So pretty soon in time, this curve goes from lag to log. In other words, a log is a multiplication. It's an x, a to the x. It's an exponential growth, all right? So the curve takes off. In other words, the population size, the number of individuals in the population takes off like gangbusters, and it's a log phase. So it assumes a parabolic projection, right? Until eventually what happens up here somewhere? Why do the number of individuals start leveling off? Typically, in a natural situation, what do we have? Some die-off. Exactly, the resources. And what is the main resource? Most animals spend their day or their night looking for food, right? And try to stay away from danger. So food is one of the main resources. In the plants, the equivalent of food is going to be what? The nutrients. No, in plants, as grass and trees, the limiting factor, those so-called limiting factors, right, are typically environmental. So these are environmental pressures. Typically, it's going to be nutrients, but for plants, even more than nutrients, because generally the soil has an abundance of nutrients for whatever vegetation is growing there. It's going to be space. And the space is going to be underneath for the roots, but also space above for sunlight. Okay, so plants is a little different, but the environmental factors are still going to be kind of limited by way of physical space because the plants individually cannot move. Generations can move from one generation to the next by where the seeds fall, right? And consider, for example, just staying on that thought for a moment, how plants move, not at the level of individual, but at the level of population, because the slash pine that we have here, I always go back to our deer slash pines, which are conifers, and where are conifers most abundant? Generally, they're adapted to freezing conditions, cold, freezing rain and snow and ice. So they belong up north. But this is a tropical environment. So how did these pines get here? They were not flown in. They were not trucked in. They came in here slowly, literally moving ahead of the glaciers during the last ice age, 10 to 12,000 years ago. The glaciers, when we talk about glaciers, we're talking about 1 to 2 miles of ice on top of us, right? It is massive, huge, and they take thousands of years to move back and forth. Glaciers are actually fed at the core, at the center, by snow that deposits there, slowly, gradually becomes ice and starts exerting pressure downward, which is then moved laterally because the glacier cannot go through the crust of the earth, so it can only move sideways. So if we compress ice down from the top, that ice is going to start moving sideways, little by little. Imagine the pressures and the forces that are involved in glaciers, but glaciers are also dynamic in a scale of thousands of years. And they move and they go back and forth and they expand and recede over the years and the centuries, and they're grinding underneath. Nothing stays alive underneath the glaciers. The Great Lakes, the 5 Great Lakes were carved out by glaciers. They're some of the deepest lakes in the world. They were literally carved out by glaciers. It's amazing. It's hard to wrap our minds around that fact. But anyway, because they are slow moving and the peninsula of Florida never got glaciarized, never had glaciers over it. They stopped more or less what is what is today Georgia and Mississippi and those southern states there, all right? The peninsula was never covered by glaciers. So it became a sanctuary, if you will, for animals who were certainly migrating actively in front of the glacier, but also plants. Little by little, generation by generation, the edge of the seedlings that were ahead of the glacier was the ones who survived. And there was enough time for those to grow and put out seedlings around them. But of course, the glacier was coming behind them. So the ones that were in front of the edge got to survive. And you can see mentally that picture, generation by generation, slowly, the population as a whole was moving forward. Even though individuals are planted where they are, and eventually they got crunched by the glacier, or if the glacier stopped right there, they just survived because I'm just in front, I'm 2 feet in front of the wall of ice that is right next to me. Okay. But basically, that happened in a very cold environment with the winterization of the earth. And therefore, the plants that were cold plant, resistant to cold were the ones who survived, which was mostly conifers. Bottom line, the whole peninsula of Florida at one time, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, was covered by pines. And this was a dominant species. These pines were so successful that they actually became the dominant species. Dominant means the largest, most abundant, tallest tree in any forest. And usually it's 1 to 2 or 3 species of trees, all right? Unless the environmental conditions change drastically, that is known as a climax community, and it remains essentially the same. We would be here. So this kind of growth curve can also apply when we composite them at the level of an ecosystem, which would be individuals from different populations or different species, all right? Anyway, back to this stationary phase here, the limited resources eventually max out the population, all right? And that's where selective pressure is going to occur, precisely, right here. The selective pressure, so only the most fit are going to survive on average, because there's also chance occurrence, stochastic processes, which we'll talk about in greater detail in this lecture, all right? But basically, that is a stationary, and unless the climatological conditions change radically, that population would basically stabilize there. But sooner or later, the climate does change over a long period of time. I'm not talking about weather, I'm talking about climate. And so eventually species do become extinct. And there is what we call a background extinction rate that is going on throughout the entire world, different regions, some places more intense than others. So there's a background extinction rate, but there's also a background emergence rate, if you will, of new species coming forward from previous species. And that's the process of what we call speciation. That process of speciation, it tends to be expansive. In other words, one species can give rise to several other new species that are certainly very similar, all right? And those are the nodes in the phylogenetic tree, the nodes. From one species, we get several other. And so going forward, it is also expansive. And then we get into cycles, of which there have been about 5 that we can tell in nature on planet Earth, where we have had massive extinctions because of a drastic change in the climate. And the most famous one was the meteorite that hit the area of what is the Yucatan Peninsula today. And that huge meteorite is still buried down there about 4 or 5 miles into the crust of the earth. Imagine the power, the speed, and the massive impact of that. Well, it caused a humongous fire and cloud of smoke that essentially covered the earth for several years, killing most of the plants. And then subsequently, when the plants die, the herbivores die. And then the omnivores that come behind this, that feed on the herbivores, they die. And finally, the carnivores, the top carnivores feeding on what's below, they die too. And that was the massive extinction of the dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. So when the dinos were wiped out, that's the most prevailing theory of this massive meteorite that hit the Earth about 65 million years ago. Okay? And that is basically the latest one. But there have been 4 others before that. We were not around as a species, so we had nothing to do with that one. Now we're into what is known as the 6th mass extinction, because the extinction rate is getting exponential also. We'll cover that in another lecture. But basically, that extinction rate is now going exponential. So it's indicating a 6th mass extinction. And this one is what we call anthropogenic. In other words, we have something to do with the extinction of the other species, of the mass extinction that is taken off right now on planet Earth, right? So that it behooves us to be a little more eco-friendly. That was one of the reasons for launching this whole Masters in Bioethics, precisely, the environmental part, so that we can be a little more eco-friendly and try to preserve the environment instead of just wiping it out. Because, of course, it doesn't take much thought to realize that if we wipe out the rest of the environment, we wipe ourselves out too, and we go with the rest of it because we still have to eat organic material. All right, so that's a population growth curve, right? What is missing from this one is that eventually, over a long period of time, all species tend to go extinct. And so the 4th phase is not shown here, but it is the death phase of a decline, right? Sometimes the decline is not fully, it doesn't go all the way down to 0, right? I getting beyond the screen here, but the decline can be maybe halfway, a third of the way, 3/4 of the way, and some individuals may survive, and then it picks up again. And then what we have actually is a cycling. That type of cycling does happen in one relationship that has been studied a lot, which is known as the prey-predator relationship. As the population of any one of these, as the population of rabbits increases, behind it, the population of foxes is going to increase, or wolves or coyotes or whatever is eating the rabbit, all right? So once the population of wolves increases, then the rabbits start diminishing, but they don't go to 0. And so as the number of rabbits diminish, then the number of wolves also diminish, but you notice there's a lag there. And then the population of rabbits gets a break from the wolves, so they start taking off and reproducing like rabbits and start climbing again. And then the wolves figure out, oh, more rabbits, so we better have more wolves, and so on and so forth. And there's this prey-predator relationship, right? And you can see that this is an expansion of the population growth curve, but going into cycles. And that happens a lot in nature. You can apply it to just about anything. You can apply it to grass and cows, for example, et cetera, or grass and rabbits, et cetera. And then you can build up a whole model. When you start doing more complex overlaying more and more prey-predator relationships on this model, you're getting into what is known as ecology, which is studying the actual ecosystem as it occurs, instead of isolating individual species here and there, but you look at a whole complex whole, which is what we call ecology, looking at the ecosystem as a whole. All right, back to slide 1 of our presentation for today. So of the 4 forces, the 4 main forces that hammer on the individual for the possibility of evolution, which were, remember, mutation, migration, drift, and selection. I covered the other 3 briefly previously. We cover them in more detail when we go into the course on environmental bioethics. But now I'm going to focus more directly on selection, all right, which is also chapter 6 of Meyer. Because at the end, Meyer makes this argument very reasonably that it is selection itself that causes the other three predispose the individual or the population for the possibility of speciation, of a new species arising. But the actual process that actually causes that species to arise or not is going to be selection itself, right? Selection. Now, I'm going to start first with artificial selection, which is what we do, and then look at natural selection in more detail, and finally, sexual selection as a subunit, if you will, or a special case. Because in natural selection, Darwin assumed that there was random mating. But there is seldom random mating in nature. There could be more on plants than on animals, but on animals, is the standard is more sexual selection than random mating, right? And so we're going to look at these three types of selection. Let's begin with artificial selection. And again, stop me for questions or comments anywhere along the line, you will. We have been involved in artificial selection for millennia in human history, ever since essentially the beginning of agriculture, about 7,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, remember in the Middle East, what was known as Mesopotamia or Babylon. Today, the confluence of two rivers that are there, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is more or less a region of Iraq and Iran and that area of the Middle East, all right? So artificial selection. In other words, this is a human process, an endeavor, but what is radically different about artificial selection from natural selection, what do you think it is? Of course, we humans are doing this, but we're doing it what? Randomly or willingly? Yes, volition is involved. The will, the human will is engaged, which is radically different from natural selection because there's no brain out there that is selecting specifically. It's a random event, right? It's a probabilistic event. So for example, here are some examples. The apples that we buy today, all the varieties of apples that exist today in the supermarket and elsewhere, right? They all come from a plant called the crabapple. And this is a photo of a wild crabapple. It's actually the size of about a cherry. And that's the original fruit, right? The crabapple. Now, this fruit is small, bitter, tarty, and full of seeds. So it's not very pleasant to eat, but it's edible. It doesn't kill us. All right, so some primitive human ate one of these and said, okay, this has potential. So we select. What do we select? The first thing we want to get rid of is the tartiness, right? We want fruits to be sweet. And because they have a lot of starch and so forth, they can, some of that will turn into glucose, fructose, saccharose, whatever the monosaccharides are, the disaccharides are, taste sweeter to us. So the first selection of the human is going to be on the more sweet of the various of one tree. So just think of the primitive original crab apple tree. I don't know if you want to put it in the Garden of Eden or not, but it was there. In fact, you know, we pictured the temptation of Adam and Eve with an apple, but that's anachronistic, or that's it's a fantasy, because if that happened somewhere in Africa or the Middle East, there were no apples. The apples belong to, it's a northern tree. So it would have been better like a pineapple or a banana. Had to be a tropical fruit, all right? Because that's it. Or guanabana or something like that. Mango, there you go. Nice and sweet, the mango. All right, so we select for the sweetest, or the less tarty rather, the less tarty of all the crab apples in this one tree. So this one tree has 10 crab apples, 10 of them, all right? We taste them all, and we select the one that is less tarty. and we plant those seeds. And then we wait for those seeds to grow, and that tree will produce another 10 crab apples. And then we select again for the less tardy one. Now, hopefully, the less tardiness will work. And we'll be selecting generation after generation, the less tardy, until at some point we make the transition from less tardy to more sweet. And we keep selecting for the more sweet, right? Now, simultaneously, we can also select for size or not. But I'm just thinking out loud here that it would be better to select for the taste first and then worry about the size. Because also of those 10 crab apples in the one tree, there will be a range of sizes, right? And what's the expectation? What kind of distribution of the sizes of the 10 crab apples that are hanging on this one tree? What kind of distribution is it going to be? The assumption is that it's going to be a normal distribution. That most of the apples, 5 or 6, are going to be about the same size, and a few will be larger and a few will be smaller. So you get a normal distribution curve. That's my intuition. I don't know. It could be that it's skewed. It could be skewed to the right, skewed to the left with the tails. But on average, the standard distribution in nature is precisely a normal distribution, right? So you can see that once we get into the sweet range of the crab apple, but still small, then we can focus on size and select, secondly, let's say, for a bigger apple, so that we get more sweetness out of the one apple tree. Now we're making the transition from crab apple to just apple. Okay? Now, this could be variations, could be varieties, or there could be new species. That's up to the taxonomists to name it, right? In classification, in scientific classification. But eventually, when the variety is not, the varieties are not able to reproduce with each other, what happens? We covered this. I remember we covered this. What is Meyer's definition of biological species? We covered biological species, right? With Meyer. All right. 2 characteristics.
Fertile offspring.
Yeah, but first, before the fertile offspring, that they're able to mate or reproduce, combine. In this case, that the pollen of one crab apple is capable of fertilizing the stamen, the eggs of another crab apple. All right, you see? So they're capable of reproducing and produce fertile offspring. Once we have that from varieties, you know, so when some varieties of the same species, are not longer able to reproduce, we are on a way to speciation. Because these 2 varieties, by definition, varieties belong to the same species, all right? Think, for example, of dog breeds. Breeds are varieties of the one dog. Canis lupus familiaris. They're all Canis lupus familiaris, but they're different breeds. We're no longer able to reproduce between the different breeds. We are on the way to a new species of dog, whatever that's going to be. It could be the dingo, for example, down in Australia, or it could be the Machiscuincle, which was the one that was in Mesoamerica with the Indians, with the native, the original native Mesoamericans. Okay, Maya, Aztec, and all those. They had a little dog that was hairless, was called Machiscuincle, an ugly little thing. All right, so anyway, that's selection, right? Certainly it can be done in plants, and has been done in plants for millennia. The original, this is the transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural. In other words, the beginning of civilization, not cultural civilization that happened about 500 years before the time of Christ in Greece. That's cultural civilization where we get the arts, the sciences, technologies, and all that, and philosophy and theology. But agricultural civilization, the beginning, the origin of agricultural civilization, about 7,000 years ago in the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, by selecting wheat, because it happened that by chance, wheat is a type of grass. Okay, so we look at wild wheat, it looks more like grass than the actual wheat that we were familiar with today. All right, wild wheat. This is not wild wheat. This is very elaborated wheat. Okay, well, it's called wild because it has a germplasm of the wild type and all that. But wheat is a grass, okay? How about field? Make it a little bigger. So wheat is a grass. And when you notice grass, for example, think of gisasso. You know the gisasso, the spurs, the one that has the little spurs. We know that when we get stuck by them, right? The grass that has the little spurs, the seeds. And those little spurs, that's the seed. So that's the inflorescence. That's the flower that turns into the seeds. And those are the reproductive structures, right? So grass, this wheat, this type of grass, started to produce, they noticed that some of this grass, the grains were a little larger, but still very small. And out of curiosity and necessity and whatever, they started eating these and figure out, okay, well, this is edible. It's not killing us, so it's edible. They started selecting on the tufts of wheat grass that were producing larger grains, and kept doing that larger and larger and larger. And of course, grass generation comes around every few months or whatever cycle it is. So it's easier, faster to grow grasses generation after generation, right? They also propagate by vegetative propagation, little shoots and so forth. So they kept selecting on the larger grain until they got to a grain that was large enough to be substantial and ground up and made the wheat flour. And that was the beginning of civilization, because eventually these primitive humans were around about 7,000 years ago in that area, were able to grow enough grassy wheat to sustain the population. So they didn't have to go after the animals any longer. They could stay in one place and become sedentary. Now with sedentary is the beginning of agriculture. Now the primary agriculture is very primitive. It basically relies on rain. It's just taking wheat grains and tossing them around, and then relying on rain to shower and on sunlight and so forth, and picking up the harvest. And then they start doing some things like primitive ditches, canals for channeling the rain around, and then maybe there's a pond or a lake nearby, or they can retain the water, and now they can do an irrigation system. Now we're going into when there's an actual irrigation system, that's a secondary agriculture. And then there's more technology put into that. Now you put a little dam on the pond to retain the water during the rainy season, and then use it during the dry season and so forth. And now maybe the channel, you'll start putting clay tiles so that a lot of water is not lost through the soil on the channel. You get more water, it's more efficient. You start introducing technology into it. Eventually, you can get into concrete and pipes and so forth and channel the water more efficiently. Now you're getting into tertiary agriculture. And then you bring in machineries like combines and stuff like that that goes through the harvest and picks it up and shoots it out the back end already packaged. That's quaternary agriculture. And then at some point, you dispense from the soil altogether and you start growing plants in water with nutrients, all right? And that's called hydroponics, and that's quaternary agriculture. And you can do that in huge hangars like, what do you call those storage areas? Not silo, that's just for storing, but where you store stuff, more sophisticated than a barn. The word doesn't come to it, but they're huge. Like they're like hangars for airplanes, right? Where you keep storage stuff. The storage warehouse, like a huge warehouse, and it's all full of ponds with water and nutrients. And the plants are growing in there, and there's artificial light, and you can control the light to optimize the growth rate for these plants, right? That's called hydroponics. It's totally artificial, and you can have that going on in the middle of the North Pole or the South Pole because it's all artificial. All you need is a lot of energy to run the system, right? And the nutrients and all that, and the water, etc. But you can see that we dispense altogether from the soil. Now, you take that one step further, and you take that huge warehouse with all the sophisticated equipment, and you send it out into space. And it can still survive in space as long as you provide the materials, mostly the energy and the materials that are needed to run it. So we can then colonize the moon by hydroponics. Okay, so it's exciting and kind of dangerous to where we're going with all this. All right, so where was I? I was looking at selection in plants, that basically artificial selection allowed for the possibility of becoming sedentary. Oh yes, and then when you're able to grow enough food in an area, then you can stay in that area. And also you can organize your day so that some people will be doing the harvesting, other people will be grinding the wheat, and other people will be making the food and distributing and so forth. Organize the day so that there's some free time, and I don't have to be chasing the animals all the time or just looking for wildlife to eat. I can organize my day and my night, and I can start making some material culture of vases, and perhaps start writing something, and the words, now I give writing symbol, cuneiform, which started there, just a little ticks on a clay tablet, cuneiform language, about 7,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. And so you start developing material culture, and now there's more time available. The hands are free for doing everything because we cannot keep our hands steady and you know, without doing something. And you fast forward to 7,000 years later, here we are with the sophistication of technology that we have and culture, all due to selecting wheat in the Fertile Crescent and establishing sedentary life, civilization, what we call civilization, right? Take, for example, the wild mustard. This is what wild mustard looks like over here. It's a little weed that you walk around there without paying any attention to it. From the wild mustard comes a bunch of stuff, all right? For some reason, people don't like this, but they're very nutritious and they have a lot of nutritional value, like broccoli, right? Cauliflower. Cauliflower is the actual flower selected, made humongous, totally artificial. Because look at the wild mustard flower. It's a little yellow thing that is not too large, but it's edible. And so we make this big, huge thing that is now sold in the market. And you can see the cauliflower, the broccoli is a variation of the flower, but with part of the stalk, and it's green, which means it photosynthesizes because the petals of the flower are super adapted leaves. They're super adapted leaves, okay? The cabbage also comes from the wild mustard, and something called kale, which is kind of the wrinkled leaves, and something even more strange to me anyway, it's called kohlrabi. These are the lateral meristems, the little buds that come sideways on the weed. So all this from wild mustard, which is a little weed like that you just kind of discarded. Amazing. All this food that is on the market is had good value, has a market value, has nutritional value, etc., etc. Very easy to grow, and a lot of people don't like it precisely because it's good for us. Okay, so we end up what is good is bad, and what is bad is good. It also on animals, for sure. In animal husbandry, all of the animals that we have today that are domesticated or semi-domesticated, they all come from wild animals. Again, I talked about the hippos, the horse and the donkey. The original horse, the L. hippos, was actually the size of a dog, not even a large dog, a medium-sized dog, right? And look at what we have today. The cow must have been some small little creature also that ran on hooves, and so on and so forth with all the chickens, the wild chickens were little things like that. And the wild turkey, again, is a smaller animal, so forth. We have gotten so sophisticated that we even have featherless chickens. I think it was Israel that developed a featherless chicken, so it doesn't have to be plucked because plucking is generally a labor-intensive work and you got to pay the labor. So to minimize cost, Now we have the featherless chicken. It was genetically engineered, of course. In other words, the geneticists found out which were the genes, which are the genes that make for the feather, and they knocked them out. And so we got featherless chickens that are otherwise identical to a feathered chicken and edible, especially. What's the downside of featherless chickens? Can you keep them outside? No, because they're going to roast live. Okay, so they have to be kept inside all the time with artificial light and temperature and control. And again, we're back to the warehouse of chickens or whatever animal we're growing for food. And then you get into the bioethical issue of the humane treatment of these animals, right? Which is another topic, but basically pointing out that we have done artificial selection on many of the animals. And it's not just for agriculture, nutrition, etc. It's also for fun, like the pet industry. All these different parakeets, or the little lovebirds, they're all the same species. They're just varieties. So they can interbreed if they manage to recognize each other as part of the same species. So even the pet industry has been involved in artificial selection for a long time, and it's actually very profitable, right? Okay, so you get the point about artificial selection, which we select on the trait that we want to enhance. But that is done voluntarily with the will very much engaged. In contrast to nature, where there is no mind that is out there selecting on purpose. Rather, it's a chance event. So what happens? We have to be going back and forth from a deterministic model, which is this. In other words, what is a deterministic model? That we are determined individual human beings. And this crabapple is a determined specific crabapple tree that was selected upon some point back in history. And these are determined specific apples that this person is holding in their hand, all right? So we are real determined individuals, and that's what we call the deterministic model. But when we talk about evolution, we have to go into a probabilistic model. So we always preface it saying chances are, or most likely, or probably, right? We have to preface to make sure that we are in a probabilistic model, right? Which opens the possibility for chance, which was that third factor. Remember the force of evolution, drift, the chance drift. Animals, individuals, plants are moving back and forth, right? Populations. And so that drift is a random event. It's what we call a stochastic event. Remember the individual walking around and crunching beetles. As he's walking, he's not paying attention. He's not really selecting the green or the brown beetles. He's just moving at night, not realizing that he's crunching beetles along the way, right? So it's a stochastic process, a chance process. The lightning hits a tree by chance. On average, we can say it's the largest tree, but that's on average, All right, so we're going to shift into natural selection now, which involves, it assumes random mating, okay? Random mating. This is a big thing. It's a big caveat. It's a big presupposition. Because like I say, in nature, there's seldom random mating, especially in animals, and in plants more. Random mating because, of course, it's the pollen goes all over the place. And probability of fertilizing, of the pollen fertilizing one egg or another egg is about the same, approximately, right? So random mating is more in plants than in animals. Anyway, Darwin, in order to get a grip of his model and to be able to understand it better at the level of detail, this is one of the assumptions. We always have to make some assumptions in order to run through a model and see if it works or not, if we can observe the results, test the hypothesis in nature, all right? So obviously, and pretty much always, our models are gonna be what we call simplistic. They exclude, okay, I'm gonna exclude the fact that we go through seasons, dry season and rainy season, depending on what I'm measuring. I'm going to exclude the fact that some days are more cloudy than other days. I'm just going to assume light in general, and so forth. We make assumptions. So his big assumption was random mating, which it doesn't make it that realistic, but at least it got the model going for the possibility of evolution. If you want an analog for Mendel, the Mendelian genetics, they don't occur much in nature because it's an all or none effect. And we know that most traits are not all or none. They are quantitative traits. In other words, there is precisely variation, which is what we saw last class, right? Variation. So most traits are quantitative, and they're also interactive with genes interact with each other. So really Mendelian, we'll call Mendelian genetics, is very simplistic and it seldom occurs, and is that all or none characteristics, just straight up dominant recessive alleles. All right. Now, 5 observations that we had that led him to conclude evolution by means of natural selection. It's even in the title of his book of Origins, right? The origin of species by means of natural selection. So he's putting the whole thing, he's giving you the answer right there in the title of the book itself. All right, so there are 5 observations that he noticed, and he inferred from each one of those observations a series of inferences that led him to the conclusion, the overall conclusion that yes, evolution, in other words, the emergence of new species may occur through this process of what he calls natural selection. All right, so these are the 5. There's high fertility and an overabundance of gametes and an overabundance of zygote. This is called pre- and post-zygotic selection, which we'll see later on. I actually have a slide for each one of these 5, okay? Don't worry about it. This is just, I'm giving you the summary straight up, and then we're going to go through at least one slide of each one of these observations and inference with actual examples. So just to read them through, for example, first, there is an overabundance of gametes and an overabundance of zygotes. That exponential growth curve that I talked about. So the inference is that we don't see the world overpopulated with all these species. You know, we're not like this totally jam-packed crowd with all kinds of populations of species, because that would be the expectation if all of these overabundance of gametes and zygotes were to survive. We don't see that. We see just a few individuals of each species forming populations more or less dense in different parts of the world, right? Which means that the vast majority of gametes don't fertilize and the vast majority of zygotes don't survive. All right, I'm trying not to get into too much detail because I actually have examples for each one, but just to name them. So that's one inference. Vast majority of zygotes of individuals don't survive to adulthood, to reproductive age. Then another observation, populations in nature tend to remain stable over time. Unless there's a drastic change in climate, populations tend to remain the same. Even in temperate regions where you have in the fall, the leaves of the trees fall off, and that's why it's called the fall, right? Those trees are called deciduous trees. They lose their leaves, but stick around through the winter. In the spring, when the showers begin, the temperature gets a little warmer. Guess what? Those leaves come back. They spring back, and that's why we call the spring, because they spring back forth new leaves. And the tree was not dead. The tree was dormant, right? So year after year, we see the same phenomenon occurring. And so populations that exist right now tend to remain the same year after year, approximately. So what do we see? We see stable state. We're looking at stationary populations in their dynamic state occurring all around us. So the inference is that because populations are more or less stable and they don't continue to grow exponentially, right? Then most individuals don't make it to reproductive age, or if they do make it to reproductive age, they don't actually mate. They don't get to reproduce. Right? So that's another inference, just from observation. Notice he's using his brain, right? He's thinking about what he's seeing. The next observation was resources are limited resources. There's not unlimited resource. There's a limited number of rabbits for this prairie here, for the coyotes that are after the rabbits. So the resources are limited. They can be biotic factors, living organisms. There's a limited amount of grass in this patch for the cows that are coming. Or they can be abiotic factors, like the nutrition, the temperature, the sunlight, the amount of water. Specifically, the water is a big limiting factor, mostly for plants, but also for animals, because it's needed for life. And therefore, so that's the observation, limited resources. And therefore, there is selection pressure. There you go. That's the insight. This is the pivoting point. This is kind of the point of inflection. There must be selective pressure going on, acting on natural populations, because natural populations are kind of steady. They're not all wiped out, and they're not all growing exponentially. And therefore, there must be some kind of a pressure on the population to remain in that steady state with limited resources. And what's causing the pressure is precisely the limited resources. Then, from a different angle, you notice that no two individuals in a population are exactly the same, are totally identical. This is the argument of the identical twins that I presented earlier. If even identical twins have slight differences, and I'm not talking just human, but across the board for animals and plants, right? Then there must be, that pressure may act on that variation, on the variation, so that on average, that's the probability, the individuals to survive are the most fit, Now, fitness is not an LA Fitness of the gym, all right? Fitness is genetic fitness. And genetic fitness may or may not express, because we talk about genotype and phenotype. What is being selected, is it on the genotype or the phenotype? It's a phenotype, because the genotype is opaque, obscure, occult, hidden. The genotype is hidden from the selective pressure, from the environment pressures. Literally, even physically, think about it. Where is the genotype physically in the cell? In the nucleus of the cell. So the cell is not only protecting the genotype by its cell membrane, also by a nuclear membrane. So there's a double protection to get to the genotype. So
environment and foods that we eat are carcinogens like that too?
Yes, they can, but that's the chance event there. That's the mutation. Okay. See, that's the mutation. That is really what predisposes. But even a mutant, we know, first of all, that most mutations are going to occur, just on average, in the junk region, the 97%. So they're innocuous, they're neutral, they don't affect, unless they hit actually an exon, right? They're not going to express. And even if they hit an exon, that exon may or may not express. Or where it expresses, it may or may not cause an effect on the phenotype. And remember, the first level of phenotype, I made an emphasis on that. The first level of phenotype is going to be the polypeptide that comes out of that exon, right? And then there is the alternative folding. There's the alternative combination of polypeptides to form the three-dimensional folded protein that is actually functional. And even there, the protein has an active site, but also has another region that is inactive. So what if that mutation ended up on the exon that produces the inactive site of the protein? Even that's not going to express. So you see, the chances of getting a mutation that is actually harmful is very small, right? And even there may be that the mutation on the active side of the protein may actually enhance the protein. And then that's a positive mutation. It's that one, that positive mutation that gives for the possibility of the emergence of a species eventually in time. So imagine all the level of complexity of mechanisms that need to fit together to make for the possibility of that new species. It's just amazing. Chances are that it's not going to occur, right? But it does occur because we do have species, we don't have just one herbivore and one carnivore, or one plant, one herbivore and one carnivore. That would close the cycle. We would only need two species. We would need one species of plant, one species of herbivore, one species of carnivore to have a complete cycle of life on Earth. And we don't, right? We have millions. All right, so the probability of survival is very complex, very complicated, right? But the chances are that the animal or the plant or whatever organism it is not going to survive. The chances are against survival. That's the pressure. Now, finally, the last point is that many of these variations are inheritable, not by way of Lamarck, not the Lamarckian inheritance that the giraffe grew the longer neck by trying to reach at the leaves of the acacia tree that were getting higher and higher on the tree, right? Not because acquired characteristics within a population within one generation are generally not passed on to the next generation precisely because they don't impact the genotype. Precisely because that phenotype that gets enhanced does not go into the genotype. The genotype is protected, except in what general group of organisms that can happen. The inheritance of acquired characteristic, which is the phrase. In what group of organisms can this indeed happen? And we are actually seeing it happening, and it's a big danger, it's a big bad news. Hint, it's occurring in hospitals, mostly in the vent system of the AC in the hospital. Yes, the superbugs, what is known as the superbugs, the bacteria that become immune to an increasing number of antibiotics. These are the superbugs, right? So the broad spectrum antibiotics are not working. That's why it's a big discussion today, whether to prescribe the antibiotic or not. And, it's a standard prescription for infections and so forth, but we're running into that problem. These are bacteria that are immune and then reproduce very fast, but it could be that some of them actually the DNA is being altered, and that is going to be passed on from forever into that progeny. All the progeny of that bacterium that mutated is going to be passed on, right? So it could have had the predisposition already, could have been mutant, it could have been immune to that particular antibody, or the bacterium may have survived the insult, the biochemical attack of the antibody, and through that attack develop a mutation that has caused immunity, right? Okay, but it has to be obviously a very simple organism that is unicellular and in fact, in bacteria, they're prokaryotes precisely because they don't have a nuclear membrane. They're not eukaryotes, right? So that nuclear membrane is a big deal. All right, so let's go to one by one here, look at some examples in nature. The first one, the high fertility rate and the abundance either of gametes or zygotes. For example, if we want to focus in the abundance of gametes, here is a pine tree exuding pollen, right? So what's the equivalent of sperm in plants? Pollen. In fact, each pollen grain, here's a polarized micrograph of pollen. And each pollen grain inside, obviously these are different species of plants. And inside each pollen grain are two sperm nuclei, right? The first sperm generates a hole, a tube, through the pistil to get to the egg. And then the second sperm nucleus comes down and actually fertilizes the egg inside the flower or the cone in case of pine trees. All right, so there are trillions, gazillion number of sperm. It's a limited number, but it's a humongous number of sperm that is, of pollen that is being released into the air, right? You can see the cones here. The pine cones. And this particular tree has both male and female cones. Our pine trees are like that. They're called dioecious. Dioecious when they have both the male and female structures. Many plants are like that. Then other plants, other species are monoecious, meaning that one individual will be male, the other individual will be female, meaning that one individual only produces pollen, the other individual only has incomplete flowers, flowers that only have eggs, or cones that only have eggs, right? So that pollen is going to fly around, and it's a stochastic process, which pollen grain is going to fertilize which egg in which cone. It could be the same tree, or it could be the tree next door, or the tree 1 mile away. Right, so you see there's an overabundance. A lot of this pollen is just going to get stuck on the roof of the car and not go to the place of fertilization. So most pollen will not fertilize. Most sperm will not fertilize. In fact, how many sperm cells does it take to fertilize a human egg? 1 to 1, right? It's a 1-to-1 ratio. And yet, for a human ejaculate to be considered clinically potent, capable of fertilizing, clinically, it has to contain between 100 to 150 million sperm. It's amazing. The selective pressure against human fertilization is about 100 million to 1, right? It's amazing, but that's the way it is. Because most sperm will not make it to fertilize the egg. They have to travel all the way up through the uterus into the fallopian tube to the distal end, the ampulla, which is the horn, the curve of the fallopian tube. And when you put that to size, it is a huge trek. It's equivalent of miles if we put it to size of a human to a sperm cell, which is microscopic, right? And that's the most vigorous sperm on average, the most potent, capable sperm, the one that has the stronger genes is the one that's going to fertilize on average, right? So, and that's why on average, most of us are the normal healthy people because the abnormal embryos got selected out early. First of all, they weren't fertilized, and if they were fertilized, they got selected out because they didn't survive. We have a selective pressure of about 50%. 50% of human pregnancies never made it to term naturally. There are spontaneous abortions, natural losses. Most of them happen in the first couple of weeks of fertilization, of development. And the woman doesn't even realize that she was pregnant because it was only the first couple of weeks. That's where most little human embryos are lost, right? Around the time of implantation. And so this is a huge selective pressure that is occurring. And that one is called post-zygotic. I'm getting kind of a little ahead of myself because we're going to see post-zygotic in a minute. Anyway, here we have dandelions putting out thousands of little seeds that are airborne. But how many of these seeds does it take to replace the one dandelion plant? 1 seed, right? So there's this overabundance. And we don't see the world just covered with dandelions all over the place. We don't see the world covered with crabs all over the place, right? And so there's an overabundance of production of these gametes and an overproduction of actual zygotes. In other words, gametes that did fertilize. Even fungi. Here's this is called, I think it's called a sac fungus that explodes. It's a mushroom that explodes. And look at the spores. This is a little microscopic photograph of the spores themselves. From each one of these spores, a new fungus may arise. A new fungus. Look at that. And how many gazillion of the spores are there, right, in that cloud? This fungus, by the way, many of them are actually edible. Whether you want to eat it or not, it's a different story, but they're considered delicacy. I think they eat the bottom part of the fungus. Okay, we get the point there, the overproduction, and most of them don't survive. They become food for others. Right, so the stable state that I talked about is the plateau or stationary phase here. K being the carrying capacity, every species has this. Here's a baby sea turtle that didn't make it to the waterline. They hatch inside the sand and they have to go through the sand out to the surface and then wiggle away, flap their way very fast to the shore to get into the water. but there's danger in that passage, which can take just a few minutes, because here's a ghost crab, for example, that went after a baby turtle. And even when they hit into the ocean, the water line, it's not past danger, because there's a bunch of fish that are waiting for them right there at the shore. So most turtles don't make it. And that's why mama turtle puts out dozens of eggs, and she only needs one of those to replace her and another one to replace the father turtle, right? So majority of individuals don't get to reproduce. Here's is a fight between chimpanzees. And we can assume that this guy here is actually using a tool as a weapon. Look at this, very few animals use tools, but the chimp does. Remember, its genome is 99% identical to ours. It's a very humbling thing, you know, but like the French say, la petite différence, all right? What a difference it makes, that 1%. It makes a big difference. Anyway, here's the chimpanzee. Why can we assume that this is the alpha male? Apart from the fact that it looks pretty muscular, he's actually got a weapon, and he's shooing away the beta male, who is trying to mate with his females, with his harem. Now, we don't know, I don't really know if the others are also males or not, because the chimp, as I'll show you in another slide, have essentially no dimorphism. In other words, the male and the female are about the same size, and it's very difficult to tell between the two, male and female, in chimps, right? Gorillas are the total opposite. The male gorilla is huge compared to the female gorilla. Actually, the female gorilla is about the size of a chimpanzee. So there's no dimorphism here, so it's hard to tell which are the females and which is the other males, but definitely this would be the alpha male defending his harem of females, and most likely the guy that is getting beaten is the beta male, trying to sneak in and mate with the other, with his females, okay? So there's competition there, meaning that the beta male will not get to mate while the alpha male has that stick in hand. All right. That's the way to start. Eventually the alpha male will get old and die, or not able to deter the emerging beta male that will become the alpha male, right? And that's a typical thing also in mammals in general, is the harem situation. We got one male for several females. It's also a probabilistic thing, because on average then there will be a fertile female in the harem that the male is fertilizing, and so there's a greater chance of producing fertile offspring and the whole species surviving at that level of the population. The third observation, limited resources, right? So here's a drastic one. This moose in the middle of winter with deciduous trees, no leaves left, is reduced to eating what? The bark and the twigs that may be there may have some nutrition, but it's a nasty diet, right? It's a very fibrous diet. It's mostly cellulose and lignin, which is what makes the bark itself, etc., but has to scrounge for limited resources. So we can see that the weaker moose, or the moose that don't like chewing on bark, are gonna die off because they're gonna starve to death through the wintertime, right? Pretty obvious there, limited resources. Look at this one. It's amazing how a photograph can talk to us when we understand what's going on. Obviously, there's a river here meandering. And where do we see most of the vegetation growing? Along the banks of the river. So obviously, the limiting factor here is water. Walk away from that bank of the river, and you're in a dry, desertic area, right? Practically no vegetation. The only vegetation that would be out here is what we call the pioneers. So you see a little bit of greenery there, but they're hardy plants, typically small weeds that have huge root systems looking for any kind of humidity down there. But the lush vegetation, definitely along the banks of the river. Water is a limiting factor. What's the limiting factor on this plastic bottle that has been floating on the ocean for decades? Why do I know it's the ocean and not a river or a pond or a lake? These are barnacles, right? These are barnacles which are marine, they're from the arthropods, and their gills come out, and they do a filtered feeding mechanism. But the foothold has to be anchored somewhere, and they're bottom dwellers. So the equivalent of a bottom of a surface to attach is this bottle that you can tell exactly how the bottle was floating. This part was obviously exposed to the environment, right? Because it's not barnacled, not encrusted, but this bottom part is the one that's floating underneath. Maybe had a little bit of liquid, and that's where the liquid settled and make the bottle that way. And of course, with more incrustation, more barnacles will collect there. What do you think is going to happen eventually to this bottle? Hopefully, if God has mercy on us, the plastic will deteriorate. It's anybody's guess what's going to give first. If the top of the bottle exposed by ultraviolet radiation that will make it brittle, and with a wave action, you could expect that to break up and start sinking because of the mass down here that will make it sink. Or it could be that eventually this incrustation will penetrate the plastic and also make it permeable and start leaking, taking in water, literally like a boat, and sink the darn thing and take it to the bottom of the ocean. Well, it will accumulate with the other millions of plastic that is down there and become sediment eventually, right? So that future generations will discover this layer, this anthropomorphic layer of plastic in the oceans of the world, and lakes and ponds and everything else that is accumulating there. All right, so that's another drastic example of limited resources. In this case, the limited resource of the barnacles is what? The plastic bottle, the foothold, all right? They run out of space, so they colonize everywhere. They cannot go on top of the bottle because they cannot tolerate exposure to air that dries them out. They need to be immersed in water, in the salt water. Another example here, a limited resource. This is so this would be, what kind of example would this be? Is this biotic or abiotic limiting factor? Remember, biotic is living, abiotic is non-living. Abiotic, non-biotic, the bottle is non-living, all right? The barnacles are living, but the factor, right, the limited factor, the limited resource is abiotic. For the moose, limiting factor for the moose, it's eating bark of a tree that is not dead, is dormant, so it's a biotic factor. How about for the vegetation along the bank of the river? Abiotic. Abiotic is the water, right? Water in itself is not living, but it's necessary for life. So abiotic factor. All right, another example here. Oops, take them out of the way. All right, here's a carcass of something that was alive, used to be alive. It's a two-hoof animal, maybe a bull or something like that. Seems to be a snout here. Who are these creatures? The vultures. All right, notice the adaptation, by the way. Very few feathers, some feathers on the juvenile. We can tell this is juvenile because it has not lost the feathers on the neck, but the adults have lost the feathers on the neck, right? Because how do they feed? On carrion, on dead carcasses. And so a lot of blood and flesh, pieces of flesh get on the head and the face and the neck. And so they try to keep that as clean as possible without feathers, so that the feathers don't get soaked up with blood and develop parasites and bacteria and microorganisms that are going to be harmful to the animal itself, right? So you notice the adaptation of losing the feathers. They don't need the feathers, especially another conclusion that we can make. What's one of the things that feathers give to birds, aside from the possibility of flight? What do they retain by having feathers? Retain heat. But these live in a tropical environment, and so they don't have to maintain heat on the head, right? In fact, the head itself uses a lot of blood and gets warm, and we ventilate a lot of heat through the head. And so they want to have that head bold so that it can ventilate better in a tropical environment. So it's all very well adapted, right? All right, so here we have the adults competing for the carcass, and there's competition, so the juveniles will have to wait their turn. This guy's impatient, but this one here is patient. This juvenile knows that it cannot compete with the adults, which are much more aggressive. So whatever is left of the carcass after the adults eat, then the juveniles may come and eat if there's anything left. So the competition there, in this case, the limited factor is biotic or abiotic. Biotic is the dead carcass here, is the dead wolf or whatever that is, the dead bull. All right? So limiting factors. And another one, variation. Darwin makes a big point about variation, and so does Meyer, appropriately. And sometimes it's subtle, the argument is subtle, but I keep coming back to it. That's why I devote a whole lecture to it. The standard in nature is variation, right? So we call it diversity. Culturally, it's also the cultural diversity, which is being promoted today precisely because it makes for a better mix. There's people who question everything because of their culture, and then the synthesis can be a better one, right? And so we have that. But in nature, it's there. I'm talking about and this, by the way, I forgot to mention, but this selection occurs at the 4 levels. What are the 4 levels? Anatomically, physiologically, behaviorally, and molecularly, all right? That's the 4 levels where selection occurs. So this one is mostly anatomical, which what we're looking at, but think of giraffes. Not all giraffes are the same. They look the same to us, but they're not. Look at the variety of pattern of patches on their skin, on their hide, right? It could be that has a selective advantage or not. Let's assume that these are females. Maybe the male has more preference for orange-looking patch or for a purple-looking patch. We don't know, but they know. They know. So this could be a selective advantage or not. Most likely, the patch is for what? For camouflage. To camouflage itself from the lion that is never too far away, or the lioness, rather, which is doing the hunting. Typically, it's the lioness that hunts. The lion male just waits around until the lioness gets the job done and then comes in to eat the carcass. But anyway, this is typically a camouflage pattern, but it may also have some selective advantage on the. I introduced there, you notice, a sexual selection topic, right? But this involves random mating, so it wouldn't apply. The point here is variety, that variation rules. Also, that Darwin speaks a lot about variance and very little about species, all right? He doesn't really like the term species. He talks about variance. Increasing variation. From some variation, you get more variation. Human faces, for sure, and that certainly has a selective issue for us, but it's more on the sexual selection part, right? So maybe this slide is a little misplaced here. I just want to point out the issue of variation. Look at this one. These lilies. This, you can see it's the same photograph, right? Look at the pattern here. Okay. This is the same photograph of the same 2 lilies in bloom, but one is with normal light, what we call white light, right? Which is actually a composite of many wavelengths, but it's what we can see with our eyes. This is, I forget if it's ultraviolet or infrared, but it's not white light. It's one wavelength, right? And it's what certain animals see, certain insects see. So they see either infrared or ultraviolet. So they see a different pattern. We see yellow, they see orange and white. And it must be infrared because it's on the red pattern, okay? So some insects, that's what they see. And this is the pattern that attracts them to that flower for pollination. So even in ranges that we're not used to. It could be in smell, what is known as the musk of animals. Some smell we smell, some musk we do smell, but some musk we don't smell. And thanks be to God, we don't smell all the musk that is out there, right? Otherwise we'd go crazy. Yeah, sounds also. You've heard of the dog whistle? We don't hear the dog whistle. Sometimes we hear little tiny high pitch, but we know it's a high pitch, right? But the dogs hear it big time. We don't. So the ranges that are way outside of our own ranges of the senses, of the five senses, but other animals do pick it up and they can react to it. They may react. Variation. Variation in the color of these orchids, whatever they are, same species. These macacos, these shells are very typical in Cuba. Now they're endangered, but there's a huge variation of them, as you can see, all the one species. There's only one species that produces all these different variations. And of course, it's so pretty, they became collector's items and they're being wiped out through the island. They're very hard to find now. They're protected, endangered, and so on and so forth. But they're a big collective item. These shells that are a single species, tremendous variation. I think it's macacos or something like that. It has a particular name in Cuban, has a name, local name. All right. Last observation, which is actually driving to the possibility of evolution. The variations are inheritable. Again, think about the phrase that the variations are inheritable. Not because they were acquired during the lifetime of the individual, no. Because the variation was there to begin with. It came from the project, it came from the ancestors, it came from their parents. So we're not identical to our parents, for example, right? We're not identical to them. We have some characteristics of the mom. Oh, he looks like the mom. No, he looks like the dad. And they go back and forth and he looks more like the mom or the dad of the baby. Well, you know, the baby has variations, okay? Anyway, those variations already come in the genetic pool. They're part of the gene pool. So that gene pool may or may not express with the next generation, but they may be passed on. That's the whole point. The variations, the phenotype may be passed on if the genotype is passed on. If they get to mate and so forth, and the mating is successful, and the progeny reach reproductive age, right? So it's not sufficient to reproduce and produce a fertile offspring. Those fertile offspring actually have to reach reproductive age, which most of them don't. Again, they get eaten up on the way. And so then it may be passed on the phenotype. So here's again, elegant for lack of another word, an elegant example of how the phenotype gets passed on from one generation to the next. I'm focusing on these three lakes and a fish that is called a cichlid. Cyclid, they're very popular in aquariums, they're freshwater. And as you can see, there's a great variation of them. They tend to be rather aggressive and territorial. So if you have cichlids, you can only have cichlids in the aquarium because they'll shoo away and actually eat up because of territory, not because they like to eat the other fish, but they're extremely territorial. And that's what actually has contributed. It's hardwired into their genes and into their brains to be territorial. And that is what has allowed for the variation. Think about this. There are 3 lakes in what is known as the Great Rift Valley and Central Africa, Equatorial Africa. You can tell that the equator goes through here. You know, we don't realize that the equator is actually very much it's definitely in the middle of the earth, right? But us who are up in the temperate region in the Northern Hemisphere, most of the landmass is up in the Northern Hemisphere. So really the equator goes along the southern part of Africa. The bulk of Africa is actually in the Northern Hemisphere, just like the bulk of Latin America. The equator goes through the Amazon, and most of Latin America is above the Amazon. Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, most of Brazil, and Venezuela, all that is above, and certainly everything above that, right? Which includes us. Anyway, the equator is here, and that's why it's green. This is the Congo Basin, which is the other lung of the big lung of the Earth. Of the two lungs, what is the other lung? The Congo Basin in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the other one, just mentioned it, is also on the equator in Latin America, the Amazon Basin. The Amazon Basin, that's where we find the largest biodiversity of plants and animals and fungi and bacteria in the world. Well, near there's that region that's called the Great Rift Valley. It's near the Horn of Africa. This is known as the Horn of Africa here, going into the Arabic Peninsula, which would then fit here, and then the Middle East, etc. Anyway, there are these three great lakes there, three big lakes, Lake Victoria, which is very well known, and then two longer ones, Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi, right? These three lakes are lined up there, and they flow one into the other and so forth. All right, so these cichlids are native of these lakes, of the lakes that are near the Great Rift Valley over here, which I mention it because this is also considered anthropologically, looking at the fossil record, the birthplace of humanity, phylogenetic, which is what we're doing in this course. The base, the origin of Homo, at least at the level of the genus, Homo. Not sapiens yet, but maybe Homo habilis, Homo faber, the more primitive hominins, right, of the genus, from this region here, from this region of the Great Rift Valley. All right, so the cichlids are native to these lakes. This lake went dry about 17,000 years ago, dry, bone dry down to zero water, okay? And it remained that way for about 3,000 years. 3,000 years. And then it started filling up little by little about 14,000 years ago. Today, in these lakes, we find 400 different species, 400 different species of cichlids, all originating from one or two primitive cichlids, right? And so here is a diagram of the variation of the phylogenetic tree, doing the phylogenetics on these because there are some ichthyologists. Ichthyologists are the ones who study fish, who are doing genetics on this, and they do the phylogenetic tree, and they do the percentage homology of their DNA and so forth, and they see this type of trees developing, all right? So the great variety, look at it, it's amazing how much variety there is of the cichlids. And each one is to a particular lake. For example, these here are in Lake Victoria. These are in Lake Tanganyika. And these are in Lake Malawi. In fact, it's even giving us the number of species, 500 species in Lake Malawi, 500 in Victoria, and 250 approximately in Tanganyika. So it's way more than the 400 that I had. I need to revise this number. 1,000, I should put way over 1,000 here. All from one common ancestor, a primitive cichlid, all right? That happened about 14,000 years ago because that's when the lake refilled with water. You can't expect any fish to survive for 3,000 years dry, right? Doesn't happen. All right, so how did they survive? Precisely because they are very territorial, their behavior, so this is a behavioral selection. They each establish a region of the lake along the shore, that is their region, the little niche. So it may be 5 inches below the surface is one species. And then 10 inches below the surface is another species. And 15 inches below the surface is another species and so forth. So they each have their own little layer of territory and they're very localized and that's their territory and no other cichlid can come into that area. They're very, very aggressive. okay? Very protective about their territory. So you can see that it's been the behavior that has led to speciation, because then we can run it mentally within that little swath. That's their habitat, that's their niche. So whatever variation occurred there, there was a selective pressure on the most fit to get to reproduce and produce the fertile offspring, and the fertile offspring actually reached reproductive age. Many of them were eaten up before then, and the one that was swimming faster or had the more distinct pattern and so forth got to survive and pass on that variation. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful example. It is all contained within 3 lakes in one region of the world that has led to 1,000 species, 1,000 different species in 4,000 years, which is just amazing. It's a very fast rate of speciation, right? In this amount of time, because typically, remember, geologic time is measured in thousands, minimally, but more comfortably, hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. That's the time range for geologic time. And that's the time range for speciation to occur. Right? Remember that the world has had living organisms for about 4 billion years. That's 4,000 million years. It's a huge amount of time. Okay, so you can see an example there that is just elegant to study and get all the phylogenetics, to do a very exhaustive map of a phylogenetic tree down to the common ancestor, which is now extinct, of course, but has produced in 14,000 years 1,000 different species of one family of fish, the cichlids. All right. Now, I've been talking about niche and habitat. We need to define it a little bit better, because this is the local region, right? And the role that an organism plays in that local region. We have to think here in ecological terms, that no local region is just by a single species. There are many different species involved in that region, right? And there are different populations, and even what we see and what we don't see. And we don't see 2 things. We don't see what's below the ground. So, for example, I keep going back to our forest because it's right there next to us. Our slash pine forest, the 15 acres that we have of an ecosystem that is a complex ecosystem. It's got plants, it's got animals, it's got wildlife all over the place. But that's what we see. That's one ecosystem. It's all the interaction of these populations, right? But there's also another ecosystem that we don't see. And what is that ecosystem that we don't see in any one of these? For example, this savanna. We see a lioness, we see a dead zebra, we see some hyenas, and we see some vultures, right? And obviously grasses and different types of plants. We see this ecosystem all interacting together, but what's below the surface that we don't see is definitely there. And it's keeping all of this alive. The root system, for example, of the plants and the interaction. You know that biochemically plants put out toxins. They put out chemicals that establish their territory so that roots of other plants don't come into their territory. And that's a biochemical warfare that's going on down there. Each species has their own chemicals, right? And some species are more amenable to others, and the roots can intertwine a little bit, but they'll be absorbing different types of nutrients or different amounts of nutrients, etc. But there's a whole ecosystem underneath, and that's just the root system. Think, for example, of bacteria and fungi that live on the ground, right? And add to that other animals that live down there, grubs and earthworms and other larvae and even adults that live on the ground all their lives, and we never see them, but they're underground, right? In fact, when you play it forward and you think with your mind's eye going underground, there's not a cubic inch of soil that is not inhabited by some organism. Just a cubic inch, even millions of bacteria and fungi, to be sure, and then roots that are going into that area, etc. So at the end of the day, the ecosystem that we don't see, that is below ground of the ecosystem that we do see, is far more complex. At least in this ecosystem, even if it's a dense forest, we can see through some space, right? It's not totally everything down to the square, to the cubic inch, but underneath, yes, for sure. All right, and so there are two ecosystems that are going on simultaneously. We don't see one of them, but it's definitely there. That's one level. And the other level of the ecosystem that is even above ground that we don't see is all the bacteria and some of the fungi and many other microscopic organisms that we don't see but are still there in the top ecosystem, right? And they're still there. And they make possible everything that we do see. So those niches can be a very small area, like a cubic inch, or even just the top of a pin, for example, the tip of a pin for bacteria. Or it can be a huge range of acres for the hunting territory of a pod of lions, pride. I think it's called a pride of lions, you know, a lioness with her cubs. She'll need an acreage of land to be able to hunt. Right? And that's the niche, that's the territory. So we go from extremely small niches, very localized, to large territories, typically for the top carnivores that need a large area, right? These are aphids, they're called aphids, and that's their niche. It could be just one branch. So this could be a population of aphids on this little branch here, and this could be a different population of aphids. We don't know. But it could be that these two populations don't really mix. They live on that branch the whole lifetime, which could only be a few weeks or a few months. I don't know what's the lifetime of an aphid, but they're little arthropods, insect-like creatures that have a little tube, and they go in and they suck out a little bit of the sap of the plant. So they tend to debilitate the plant. There's another layer of complexity that some ants have figured out that these aphids, they're sucking out sap from the plant, which is has starch and sugars, and that accumulates in their abdomen. So some ants actually use animal husbandry of caring for cattle. This is the equivalent of cattle for ants. The ants will come from behind and with their hind legs, they'll kick the abdomen of the aphid, and the aphid will exude a little bit of that nectar, maybe the poo of the aphid, and then the ant gets that nectar and takes it down to the ant hole where it feeds fungi that grow, and they're doing farming underneath. So the ants are doing animal husbandry on top with the aphids, and they're doing farming below in the ant hole with fungi. It's amazing. Real social insects that it's kind of scary and kind of glad that they're very tiny. The ants, otherwise they really take over because they have it all figured out. And they reproduce by the millions. All right, so habitats or niches can be continuous, precisely when there's a flow like that from area to area, or they can be discontinuous when they are very localized and don't move around much. For example, lichens. Lichens are a combination. It's a symbiotic combination of fungi and algae. The algae is what produces the color because the lichen, the fungi part is kind of transparent, right? And the algae gets embedded inside the fungus. What does the fungus give the algae in the symbiotic relationship of a lichen? Yeah, location. Gives location, gives anchor, and at the same time, humidity, water, because the algae are necessarily aquatic, right? They can be freshwater, saltwater. In this case, they're kind of freshwater, right? But the fungus provides humidity, water for the algae to live inside. And the alga, then, aside from the color is a hint that the algae have, well, they photosynthesize. So they produce glucose, they produce food for the fungus in which to live. And so that fungus then can grow on top of rock, a rock or a pebble or a stone. And as this symbiotic relationship that we call a lichen is growing there, it is also producing a byproduct, which is an acid. And the acid eats away at the rock, at the stone. So over a period of time, lichens will erode stone, turn it into minerals that will leach into the ground, and then at some point start leaching nutrients into the ground area, into the soil, and new plants can come there and colonize. So that's why lichens are considered to be pioneer species that go into a barren area and begin the process of producing nutrients for the soil to become amenable and a habitat for other plants to come into the region, right? But so they're stationary or discontinuous, patchy, very visible. Also, when we look at geographical barriers, geographical regions like entire continents, right? For example, we have the old world monkeys in Africa as a continent, Asia as a continent, or the Polynesian Islands, what is known as old world monkeys. Or we have new world monkeys, like in the case of Latin America and Mesoamerica, divided by the Atlantic Ocean. So the discontinuous or patchy territories can be either very small scale or large scale, depending on the behavior of the animal or the plant or the fungus or the bacteria. So that's about niche or habitat, which is the niche is the role that an organism plays in nature in a particular habitat. Now, selection is a process of elimination. In other words, individuals generally are not selected in, they're selected out. And the ones that are selected out, on average, are the less fit, We say the weaker, but weakness, again, is not in terms of muscular prowess, right? It's actual genetic weakness, right? The weak one. What we call in Mendelian genetics, the recessive gene. Right, so here we have 3 grizzly bears at the edge of a waterfall and 1 unlucky trout or salmon, whatever it is, coming up the river, right? Jumping from layer to layer to get upstream. Why is this trout going up, or it could be a salmon? Why is it going upstream? It's going back to where? To where it hatched, to the little rivulet, to the beginning of the river, to the origin of the river, the rivulets or the streams, where it hatched, where it was spawned by its mother and father, and to spawn itself, herself or himself, going back to the origin, all right? And so you can see that journey itself is a gruesome journey. Most will not make it and will die off. So that's selection right there, all right? But I'm focusing on the selection by the grizzlies, not on the fish, because now the fish is potential food for these 3 guys. However, which of the 3 bears is the one that on average is going to get that trout or that salmon, catch it in the air? Yeah, the one with the wide gaping open jaws that is just zeroed in on this guy, plopping right in there, right? But look at where he or she, I don't know if it's a male or female, probably a hungry female. All right, but so compare even just the facial expression. I find this photo so telling. Maybe I'm projecting too much in it. This fellow is thinking about it and he's saying, why am I not there? Because I'm not at the right place for this fish anyway. This other one is getting it, so too bad. But look at this guy, look at the frown on his face or her face. This part of the male is saying, oh, no, that's too risky. I'm not going over to that edge. So which is the most bold of these 3 animals? The one that seems to be the most bold, the most fit to be right at the edge, even the ears flat back, is this fellow here, this individual. It seems to be, I would say that on average is the most fit one. Now it could be that the next frame of the photograph, it actually slipped down the thing and didn't catch and was gone. So the most fit stepped on the piece of algae that was down there and flipped and went down and didn't get to eat and didn't get to mate. So that fitness was lost. But we can say if everything pans out how it's supposed to look here, right? Most likely will happen. This grizzly will catch the food and then have a recompense for the fitness, right? So the selective pressure is between these 3 bears for 1 fish. So it's a selecting out. But there's a lot of chance involved here, as you can see, right? Okay. Now, selection is a 2-step process. When we break it down, of course, they occur sequentially. But there's like a gap between pre-zygotic selection and post-zygotic selection. So what is the inflection point in this case is the zygote. You think about it, right? And this, of course, is for sexual reproduction, not asexual reproduction. But in sexual reproduction, what's the beginning of the new individual? What is the first stage of the new individual in any sexual reproduction? Well, the product of fertilization is a process, right? But the individual, the thing, is the fertilized egg, which by definition is no longer an egg, right? Because an egg is a gamete, which is haploid, but once an egg is fertilized, that cell is no longer haploid, it's now diploid. So by definition, a fertilized egg is a zygote. We have a terminology for it, comes from the Greek zygon, which means linked or yoked, and that's a zygote. And this is universal. Again, it's not just a human, it's not just mammals, and it's not just animals that reproduce sexually, even plants that reproduce sexually. When you look at a textbook of okay, I'm not going to diverge into that because I'm going to cover it actually in the next course of beginning of human life. But the zygote is the first individual, is the first cell, the first stage of a new individual of whatever species that reproduces sexually, including the human. All right. So we know that we need sperm and egg to fertilize. And here's an actual micrograph. These are actual photographs of an egg surrounded by sperm. But now the cortical reaction has already occurred, so that we don't get multiple sperm in, only one sperm. The first sperm that contacts the egg causes a reaction on the surface of the egg that's called the cortical reaction that seals it. It seals it so that the second sperm doesn't get in there, because the second sperm will be bad news, right? In the case of a human, the egg has how many chromosomes? A number from the sleep, 23, right? Because we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 chromosomes. So the egg being haploid has 23 chromosomes. The sperm has how many chromosomes? 23. If a second sperm comes in and releases its package of sperm of chromosomes into the egg, we got 23 plus 23 plus 23, right? So that's 46 plus 23 is 69, right? And that's a highly abnormal, that's trisomies. That's trisomy for all the chromosomes. It's highly abnormal, not compatible with life. It's non-viable. That, even in the first mitotic division, is not going to survive the first mitotic division, because you don't have an even number of chromosomes going on the equator and then migrating to either pole of the cell to complete that first mitosis. And therefore, and a nanosecond after the first sperm is a second sperm, because remember, there's 100 million of them, all right? So the second sperm is right there, right next to it, but that cortical reaction occurs in a flash to seal the egg and not allow any other sperm.
One sperm comes in. Now we're talking about aneuploidies. We're talking about just a third set of chromosomes.
Well, aneuploidy happens when the eggs are actually old, and in meiosis, in arrested meiosis, when they finish that second meiosis, that the individual chromosomes migrate to either pole. Some of the chromosomes stick together and they migrate to the same pole. That's how you get the aneuploidy, all right? But here, no. Here is another way of getting trisomy that is drastic. which is if a second sperm is able to release the chromosomes inside the egg.
So it's the chromosome, but we're not talking about getting to a point where you're going to have the twins because it's fully penetrated.
Exactly. No, even if it fully penetrated, it's not viable. It's not viable. It played forward just in the first mitotic division. That trisomic zygote is not going to survive. Not going to survive. You know, even if 2 or 3 of the chromosomes are trisomic, it's not going to survive because, especially, imagine the developmental genes, right, that have to develop, that have to express early on, even after the first mitosis. They have to express already to regulate development, to do the gastrolad, the elongated body, and to regulate all the embryonic developmental process. The 3 layers to form first, ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm to form before the limbs come out, or the cephalization and all that. We'll see it in more detail next semester, okay? But I'm just saying that there is I'm just going into detail here that is too much really, but basically there's a pre-zygotic selection. The whole point about this is that not all of the sperm get to fertilize. In fact, only 1 of the 100 million that were produced, only 1 gets to fertilize. So that's selection, that's pre-zygotic selection. And that's the selection process that I say the selective pressure against sperm, against human sperm, is 100 million to 1. That's the selective pressure. So the weaker sperms are going to be selected. They didn't make it to the end of the race. They didn't get there first. They got there second. Too bad, too late. A nanosecond later. You know, it's like the Olympics. They're down to 10th of a second, right? They measure 10th of a second. But second place is silver, it's not gold. Well, the second place is no cigar, no fertilization for the sperm. That's pre-zygotic, and that occurs not only, I'm using the human as an example, or mammalian, this is a mammalian model in general, but this can occur for any species that reproduces sexually, including the plant species, right? That reproduce sexually. Again, I just emphasize that with pollen. That's pre-zygotic. There's also selective pressure post-zygotic, all right? So again, play the zygote forward. The zygote needs to develop and survive all the way to adulthood. That could be a few months later, like in the case of an arthropod, a crab, or an insect, or something like that. Or it could be decades later, like in the case of adults, a reproductive adult, right? So the post-zygotic selection doesn't stop, it continues. For example, first, let's think of the case of the human, which is what I have illustrated here in stages. That zygote needs to split and go into the 2-cell layer stage, the 2-cell stage, and then the 4-cell and 8-cell. Now we're into the blastocyst. First the morula, then the blastocyst, all the different stages that we'll see in detail later. But basically, that zygote eventually has to become an embryo, and the embryo has to become a fetus, and 9 months later has to be born, right? And so there's selective pressure during those 9 months. I'm saying that on average, about 50% of human pregnancies never make it to term naturally. I'm not talking about a procured abortion. I'm talking about a spontaneous abortion or a miscarriage. It was a natural loss. About 50%, it's a very high rate of loss. We have one of the highest rates of loss of pregnancy in the mammalian world. And that's natural, that's just there. That's why most of those zygotes, most of those little embryos, what do you think was the problem with them? Because they were selected out, right? They were somehow weakened, not as fit. Well, you can take it all the way down to the genetic level, that they had some kind of genetic abnormality. And typically in the developmental genes, so they didn't get to gestate, they didn't get to go through the embryonic stage normally, and the uterus naturally discarded them. It's a natural selection process.
You're aware of, or most of them you're not even?
Most of them were not, because the vast majority of those at that 50%, right? Now we're into that subgroup. Over 90% of those occur in the first 2 weeks of pregnancy. So the woman is not even aware that she's pregnant, right? It's around the time of implantation, which is the other critical event, because see, the embryo or the blastocyst, which is this proper stage, the blastocyst has to convince the endometrium that it is a friend and not a foe, because the endometrium is ambiguous about this creature that is trying to implant, trying to embed, trying to come in. Maybe it's a parasite. It's trying to come into the endometrium, right? And establish a placenta. So why is the endometrium ambiguous? This is all biochemical. Why is the endometrium ambiguous about that blastocyst? Well, 50%, it's a 50% thing. 50% of the genes of the blastocyst came from whom? From the mom, which is the endometrium belongs to the mom, right? So it's the same genetic, it's the same genotype. But another 50% of that blastocyst comes from the dad, which is foreign to the endometrium, because it's not the dad's endometrium, it's the mother's endometrium. And so the embryo, the blastocyst, literally has to convince the endometrium biochemically, this is so biochemically, that it is a friend and not a foe, to allow the endometrium to penetrate it and embed in there and establish a placenta, and even not just like a place where you allow me to stay in here. No, you're actually going to nourish me. So the syncytial trophoblast, the outer layer of the blastocyst, becomes a placenta, right? And the placenta is a very complex vital organ for the embryo that has capillaries on the embryonic side and has capillaries on the maternal side. And those capillaries at some point fuse and exchange. The blood of the mother is going to go into the child, and the blood of the child is going to go into the mother, to the point that we know that moms, after their first pregnancy, they carry in their bodies for life fetal cells. Amazing. That actually stimulates the immune system. There's a whole complexity going there.
Carrying cells, definitely when that baby develops all the way through the 40 weeks of pregnancy, or
yes,
in the case of others, carry that DNA.
Yeah, you're talking about a procured abortion now, yes, or a spontaneous. Yes. A procured abortion, yeah, because the abortion is once the fetus has already established, or even the embryo has established that that placenta. Remember, that's one of the first events that needs to occur in biology to start the gastrula, neuralization, and all the formation of the little organs, right? Up until 8 weeks. At 8 weeks, we already have all of the organs in place, all the vital organs. But we're only about 1 inch long.
Those cells will stay within them.
Yes, of course. The older the fetus, the more cells go into the mother, right? Just proportionately. But even from the very beginning, there are a few cells that are sneaking in there already. Yeah. And from the mother to the embryo also. Okay. So very, very interesting dynamics that are occurring there when it's all natural. But anyway, my point here is that the zygote has to make it all through gestation to birth, 9 months in the case of the human, and there are selective pressures going on there, right? Some are internal selective pressures and some are external, depending on the behavior of the mother during her pregnancy, for example. That could be at risk or not of the baby. Once the baby is born, it's not all done. Life has just begun, or the challenges have just begun for that individual. That individual now has to survive to adulthood, find a mate who is also fertile. Hopefully this individual is fertile, right? And they actually need to mate and procreate and have the baby. So imagine all the selective pressure that is against that. Many people don't find their mate in the world. And if they find a mate, the mate may not be fertile, or they may not be fertile. Therefore, the in vitro clinic, which is a multi-billion-dollar clinic to provide children to infertile couples who shouldn't be reproducing because they're infertile for a reason. So that opens a whole other kind of worms in bioethics, which we'll cover next semester. But basically, you know, a couple dozen years from birth to mating, to have the child who hopefully is fertile himself or herself, so that we don't really get to test whether there was reproductive success until the third generation. Because here is grandpa and grandma. These are the children. Hopefully they're not siblings, right? They come from. So this is the parents of either him or her. I don't know which one. But it's one of the two of the couple who are the parents of these kids. But I'm illustrating 3 generations here. And it's not until these children are produced by the parents, which means that the parents are fertile. Therefore, that's the proof of principle that the grandparents produced fertile offspring. So the grandparents of her and him. So this is one set of grandparents. We don't know who they are, you know, if it's the grandparents of her or him, but it's one of the two. And and the grandparents of the other, the same argument falls. By virtue of the grandchildren, it proves that grandparents produce fertile offspring. Okay, but it takes actually a 3rd generation to see if this child is a fertile offspring, not just an offspring, but a fertile offspring. And it may be that this child may never mate, even though he is fertile, he may never mate. He may not find his mate or doesn't want to mate or becomes a priest or whatever. So you see, most zygotes will not make it all the way to grandparenting. Okay? And there's selective pressure there. All right. So the pre-zygotic selection, which is illustrated up until fertilization, is generally microscopic. And the post-zygotic selection is general macroscopic, but it has still a macroscopic beginning in the gestational period. All right. Now, it's 11:45. We've been on it for a while. I'm going to introduce another topic here, which is the competitive exclusion principle. So I think this is a good place to take a little break, unless there are any questions or comments of the observations of Darwin, selective pressure, and it boils down to the selective pressure and can either be pre-zygotic or post-zygotic, right? But the whole idea is that zygote going to produce a fertile offspring or not, for the characteristic to be passed on? You can see that chances are that any individual zygote will not produce fertile offspring, or many selective pressures that occur along the way, right? And on average, which zygote will eventually produce fertile offspring? On average, the most fit, okay? The most fit. Which fitness is going to start genetically, but will then express or not express phenotypically to allow all of this to happen. Think about that during the break. We'll come back by 12 noon, and then I'm going to speed it up for the second half. Okay. Pause recording here. Okay, so any questions or comments of anything up until now? Takes a little while to see this process of selection. You can see that it's complex, it's complicated, it has several layers involved in it. But basically, we can see that it can happen in nature. Of course, even Meyer makes this point that we don't actually experience evolution because it's an inference, right? We see the result of evolution. We see the species that are around us today. But it's already past, it's happened already. And therefore, we have to infer, like Darwin did, from observations of what we see around. Okay, Another principle that is also important in the process of evolution or the possibility of evolution, precisely because of the niche, right, is this competitive exclusion principle. This one will also be important for us when we do the phylogenetics of the human species, the human race, because of the coexistence of various hominins, like I've mentioned, various species of Homo at the same time, and how eventually we or Homo sapiens got to displace Homo neanderthalis, at least in Europe, fairly recently. It goes back to about 40, 50,000 years ago, which is not that much in geologic time at all, right? So very recently. Anyway, this competitive exclusion principle is that any two species which are competing for the same resource will eventually displace. One species will displace the other. Okay? Precisely because of better fitness. So you see an example here. In phase 1, there are only yellow birds, and the yellow birds are going after the bugs on the tree, all over the tree. Then come in the red birds. Turns out the red birds are also going for the same bugs, same black bugs. But the red birds do better on the bark, or it could be that the yellow birds can hide better inside the canopy of the tree. And so they're not found as much. And the red birds go for the easier prey, which is going to be on the bark. They're more visible or more abundant. It's hard to tell, but any of these variations. What will happen eventually is that the yellow birds are displaced away from where the red birds are. Okay, so that's the competitive exclusion principle, where one species displaces another species because they're competing for the same resources. Now, again, on average, which species will displace the other one? The species that in general is more fit, you see? So again, we're back to fitness. The red birds seem to be more fit than the yellow birds. Maybe they're a little bigger or whatever, or stronger, or they can spot the prey better, but they'll displace the yellow birds so that the more fit species has the better niche, where it's easier to pick on the prey, on the food. All right, so that's the competitive exclusion principle, and that is considered high selective pressure because two species that are typically related are competing for the same resources. That's the case of the cichlids, for example. It's a competitive exclusion principle that allowed this to happen, all right? That's graphically very, very evident because each one of these species of cichlids actually inhabits a location on the lake. All right. We can also ask the question, what does selection act upon? Because again, selection is not a mysterious brain that is out there, part of the ether or the atmosphere that is saying, okay, I'm going to be selecting this individual species and so on and so forth. No, selection is an event, it's a happening, right? That we're just giving it a name, but it's a happening. It's a dynamic event that happens. So we can ask the question, this selective pressure, what is it selecting on? Or what is it selecting upon? The first level of selection is on the individual. It's on the individual organism that belongs to that species. So the individual in the species, this individual horse, this individual praying mantis, whatever it is, this individual pine belonging to a species, okay? And remember, that's at the 4 levels of existence, which is the anatomical, physiological, or metabolical, behavioral, and molecular, right? Those four levels that the pressure can exist. So this could be at the level of the four main groups of living organisms. Protists or microorganisms are typically unicellular or sometimes form colonies like algae. The fungi, the plants, the animals, and also we would have to include in here the bacteria. Now, we have some, the phenotype is both simultaneously stable and evolvable. It can evolve. So stable in, when we look at outside the window, when we look at nature out there, right? We see species that are living, interacting, cycling, associated with weather and so forth. They're living. They form what we call the ecosystem. We can assume that on average, these are the most successful species today because they're living today and they form colonies, they form populations, and those populations are living and thriving, right? That's when we get into some populations are at risk because they're rare, they're more delicate, there's a stronger selective pressure, a very strong selective pressure on nature from the human is what? What is a very strong selective pressure on nature from the human species? Think of habitat. Nature has to live somewhere, but we also have to live somewhere. So habitat loss, precisely. We are selecting against nature, by habitat. We're encroaching on nature more and more as we expand. There's still a lot of territory in the world, but little by little, we're encroaching on nature precisely because we are at the log phase of population growth. We're still at the log phase. I never answered your question originally, but we, as humans, we're at the growth curve. And in fact, the carrying capacity of the human is not known. It's the only species that we cannot really figure out. What are the limiting factors? Of course, food is one, but with technology and agriculture and all this and animal husbandry, we're producing our own food. In fact, now they're coming out with synthetic food. You can look at some videos of synthetic food. It sounds yucky, but it actually looks pretty tasty. And they don't taste. They do a synthetic hamburger. Don't ask me what's in it. It's protein, it's synthetic protein that has been grown in the lab. But they chop it up and slice it and put a nice little sauce on it. And the protein itself is kind of tasteless. It's the sauce. What you're tasting is the sauce, right? And so that's where we're going. And they're testing it right now out there in the market to see if it's marketable. And if it's marketable, then we can expect to see more of it. But regarding habitat, we actually have to live somewhere. The International Space Station that is going around only holds about a dozen astronauts. It doesn't hold 8 billion people. So we're taking up space. That's the footprint that we talk about, right? The ecological footprint to try to minimize it and make it eco-friendly and so forth. But that encroaches on the rest of nature that also needs that space. So there is a dynamic process going on here whereby the phenotype is both stable of the organisms that we see living today, but at the same time is amenable to evolve, is evolvable. For example, what I have here, I have the foot or the leg, which has evolved independently dozens of times in evolution. For example, bivalves, which are mollusks, right? They have what is known as a muscular foot. And there it is. This is a photograph of the muscular foot. It's kind of a muscle thing that comes out. And the clam there goes skipping around on the sand, jumping around, okay? And that is a means of locomotion. It's a foot locomotion. Very different, totally different from the tube feet of a starfish. That is a hydraulic system. This tube feed actually is a whole system. It's a network of these little tubules and is filled with water, with seawater. And it's pumped in there, and by turgor pressure, the animal actually gets to move these feet around. And each starfish has literally dozens of these tube feet that move the starfish and the sea urchins around. It's another type of foot, which is very different from the muscular foot of the clam, right? These are mollusks, these are arthropods, these are echinoderms. So obviously these feet evolved independently of each other to have the same function. Another example, in insects, this is a praying mantis, which 3 paired legs that are articulated with an exoskeleton and so forth. So again, a very distinct type of foot or leg has developed in arthropods, in insects, in crustaceans, in crabs and lobsters and so forth, that is different structurally, anatomically, from the tube feet of echinoderms or the muscular feet of mollusks, and yet it has similar function, which is to move the creature around. Another one is us, mammals, and vertebrates in general, with an internal skeleton, which is also articulated, but it's not an external skeleton, right? So it has a different evolutionary process. And we can say that locomotion has evolved in nature many different times, independently of each other, right? These are not ancestors of each other. These are all living creatures today, and there are no living contemporary ancestor, right? So you see, when we observe a little and we start thinking how, so evolution is all a process of how, right? How did this come about? Well, the legs of an arthropod came about independently from the legs of an echinoderm or a mammal or a mollusk. So what we see is the product of the evolution, but we don't see the actual evolution occurring in time because we don't live eons, we don't live thousands and thousands of years to observe it. Now, beyond acting on the individual, natural selection also acts on the population at large, okay? And so there are other objects of selection, if you will. It's a secondary wave, or not wave necessarily, but a secondary object of selection also can be the gametes, for example, or group selection. This would be at the level of a population, where entire group is selected out, like in the case of the dinosaurs, bad luck that they were at the wrong place at the wrong time on Earth when that meteorite fell. Or it could be kin selection. Kin is by family members or competing with each other, siblings competing with each other in nature for food resources, for example. That could be a selecting out process. Interspecies, like a competitive exclusion principle, interspecies selection, again at the level of population. Or even clad. Clad is an ecological term that is kind of an alternative to a biological species definition, all right? And the clad typically involves, a clad is a whole group. Again, I keep mentioning the dinosaurs, that would be a clad selection, an example of clad selection. Well, a large group of individuals of different species get selected out due to a natural phenomenon. In fact, that clad selection of the dinosaurs were the most obvious animals that got selected out. But you can see that many plants also got selected out in that same event because of the cloud of smoke that covered the Earth for several years, right? And so many plant species also got selected out, that it wasn't as obvious. And we have fewer fossils of plants than we have on animals, because from plant, the cellulose fiber eventually breaks down. And so all we have left typically is imprints, or sometimes the trunk did become carbonized, become mineralized, and made a fossil out of it, what we call, what is that, the fossil of plants, plant branches and plant trunks. What is that called? There's an actual name for it. It's like, it's mineralized, so it's like a rock. It will come to me, but there's a name of fossil plants that have become mineralized. Anyway, So when it's at the level of a clade, which is a large group of species belonging to a family or a class, right, at that level. All right, finally then, all right, a few more questions, a couple more questions about evolution. Why is evolution so slow in general? Well, again, looking out the window into the ecosystem that is in nature around us, we see that the majority of species that are existing today, they're existing today precisely because they are the most fit. So they have already overcome a great deal of selective pressure, and they are well adapted. They are the best adapted to the particular climate that we have. Not weather, because weather is cycling, but climate, all right? So long range. The species that we see around today, in general, are the most fit. So there's less pressure on the current species that we see, and that's why it's low. Selection is slow because it's counting on those drastic events, right? Or either a drastic climatological change, which is a big selecting factor, or alternatively, it would be a chance mutation. But the mutations, again, the background mutation rate is about 10,000 per, one mutation per every 10,000 years or something like that. So it's a very slow chance mutation that is occurring in the background of genetic mutations, all right? So given drastic change, we can expect some evolution to occur. And one very good example is the superbugs. The superbugs, what I mentioned earlier, which is by use of antibiotics, which is totally artificial, they're man-made, right? Are selecting a bacteria, and the fact that bacteria reproduce under ideal conditions. When do we get a next generation of bacteria? Anybody know? Ideal conditions for bacteria? Like in the lab with the proper medium and temperature and all that, every 20 minutes. Every 20 minutes, so we get 3 generations in an hour. 6 generations in 2 hours, 9 generations in 3 hours. Remember, we went from 1 bacterium to 1,000 bacteria in 10 generations, okay? So, and then the next 20 minutes, after 3 hours, the next 20 minutes, we get double the population of bacteria. And another 20 minutes, double that again. So definitely goes log phase. It just ramps up very, very fast. Okay, so by the time we get to the 4 hours, actually, you have too many bacteria. You have to stop the culture, otherwise it's too many, all right? So the superbugs is one example, drastic, of where we're actually observing within hours, sometimes days, right in front of our eyes, selection by the antibiotic stress factor. All right, the third type of selection, remember, is sexual selection, because everything that I've been talking about here with natural selection, it assumes what? Random mating. But in fact, random mating seldom occurs in nature, especially with animals. In plants more, because the pollen is going everywhere, right? But with animals, it's different. Animals, the standard is sexual selection, which is kind of a ding on Darwin's theory, because Darwin assumed random selection to develop his theory, random mating, right? To develop his theory. Still, the theory holds with tweaking, all right? But the theory in general still holds of one species emerging from previous species, from previous ancestral species. So there are 2 general mechanisms in sexual selection. Now, sexual selection, of course, is non-random. It involves mate choice. Somehow a selection is targeted. It's not random. It's not a roll of the dice, all right? There's a purposeful. Now, I don't want to say voluntary necessarily, because it could be instinctive, right? Voluntary in the human, but in the rest of nature, it's going to be instinctive, but yet it's targeted. It's not random, right? And so there are 2 general mechanisms. And the 2 general mechanisms, on the male, competition, and on the female, choosing the male. So generally, the female chooses the male, and these are the 2 mechanisms and they alternate back and forth. So let's look at it. For example, again, looking at those 4 levels, right? Anatomical, physiological, behavioral, and molecular. Some are easier to observe than others. For example, the molecular is too sophisticated to observe just at plain sight, but anatomical and behavioral, yes, we can observe at plain sight, all right? And one common characteristic is what is called, one common observation is what is called the dimorphism. So when we're talking about sexual selection, we're talking about 2 sexes, male, female, occurs in nature, and there is the possibility of sexual dimorphism, right? So again, we're into this Greek and Latin terminology. Morph is shape, right? So morphology is the study of shape. It should actually be called shapeology, not morphology, because morph comes from form, right? Form, somehow the word got juxtaposed. But form, when scientists talk about form, and empirical scientists talk about form, they're talking about the shape of the thing, the structure of the thing, the structure of the share, all right? But in philosophy and theology, the form is different from the shape, right? Because the form is the essence, it's the substance of the thing. So for example, there's the shape of the chair, that's the shape. But the form of the chair is its essence, its chairness, its function, that is for sitting and not for flying around, for example, okay? Well, the flying is the air, is the airplane, the plane. And so form and shape in philosophy and theology are 2 different concepts. Okay? Form is more the essence of the thing. But in empirical science, they are synonymous, form and shape, so that we have a whole science that studies the shape of animals and plants and things. It's called morphology, right? So morphologically, there could be dimorphism or not. So dimorphism means 2 shapes. In other words, 2 sizes, right? And it could be the male is bigger, as in the case of the gorillas. And there is the female, which is kind of the size of a chimpanzee, but looks differently anatomically, but the size-wise, right? And the male at least twice as large. Or it could be the female larger, in the case of frogs, amphibians in general, some fish also, and so forth. The female is larger. Or there's no dimorphism. In the case of other fish and many other animals, birds, some birds have a drastic dimorphism, one like the peacock, male and female, very distinguishable, but mockingbirds, not distinguishable male and female, except for the song. So that's a behavioral one, right? The mockingbird. These are clownfish, they're called clownfish from the Pacific Ocean. The male and the female are indistinguishable. That happens a lot in fish. Other fish are very distinguishable. So it's just the way it is. A little more refinement, when there is dimorphism, right? It could be moderate or extreme. For example, in the case of the gorilla, do you think it's moderate or extreme? It's extreme. The male is definitely much larger than the female, just at plain sight, okay? And that occurs in the vast majority of males and females gorillas, right? Even though it's a quantitative trait and they'll hover around the mean, but it's extreme dimorphism. In humans, it is dimorphism, but it's moderate. Remember how we saw the growth curves of men and women? And there was an average difference of about 4 or 5 inches, which is actually quite a bit. Depends, if you're using high heels or not, but that's it. Most men don't use high heels, right? Because they don't need to get any higher. But that moderate dimorphism has behavioral consequences, like in the fashion industry, to design high heel shoes, right? But it's a moderate dimorphism, right? And that's an evolutionary product. Probably most likely, if we take the human back to the cave men and women, right? Think of the Flintstones, for example. When we were cavemen and women, about 200,000 years ago at least, anywhere from 200,000 to 2 million years ago, right? Even at the level of genus of the Homo. who was doing the hunting? Generally the male. And who was doing the babysitting? Generally the female. So the female was in the cave, a little more protected, needed nurturing, but didn't need that much musculature, whereas the male needed a larger frame to fight off the ones who were hunting them, like the tiger and everybody else, okay? And so we can see the slight dimorphism as an evolutionary consequence of the male and female behavior very early on. And then it stuck, and it hasn't been selected out yet because they're still pointing to our somewhat different roles of the male and the female, at least at the biological level, which has behavioral repercussions. Anyway, that's with regards to dimorphism. And then we can expect, selection is going to occur. Dimorphism also plays into the mate selection. And it also plays into the male fighting, right? And showing off and so forth. Now, let's look at the competition, for example. Competitions typically is involving pheromones or hormones, etc. And it also involves provisioning. What is provisioning? Also known as gifting, is when the male brings some things to the females. And this is funny to watch in birds. Male birds will go out and get a showy, something that's pretty, even a piece of plastic that's colorful, and bring it to the female as a gift, which is innocuous in the sense that it's like bringing flowers to the female, right? But doesn't have, it's an aesthetic value, but doesn't have other different is actually provisioning food, which will make a good male, right? Because, this male can provide food while the female is caring for the nurturing of the babies or the chicks or whatever they are. So some males do that, and that gives them more fitness, more vigor, because they are better fit than another male that is kind of lazy and is not providing food or as much food, okay? Then there's the male competition and fighting. Most of the male fighting in nature doesn't lead to death. It's very far removed from death. They're just pushing each other around to see who's actually stronger, physically stronger, to dominate the territory and to dominate the harem. You notice that the harem, in the case of these two male elks that are going at each other, there are two females here. One seems to be interested. The other one doesn't seem to be interested in the fight. But anyway, it's what it is. Eventually, one of these two males will win out the contest of pushing back and forth. And that typically, on average, is going to be the alpha male. So the expectation is that the alpha male is the one that is most fit, has the better genes, will then has a better chance of passing those genes on, et cetera, et cetera. You can play it forward to all the consequences of that. It happens in many species. For example, these, you know what these are? These are, called Siamese fighting fish, because they do come from the Far East over there. Where it used to be called Siam. I think it's Myanmar now, the country of Myanmar. Anyway, beta splendors, they're called beta splendors. They're also known as beta fish. This is the male. And this is one species, beta splendens. And this is look at the variety that there is in the males, okay? The female is very drab color looking, not very impressive. So who do you think is doing the selection? The male or the female? If this is the display, the variety of males, the female is selecting the male. Female is selecting the male, right? And the male will flare out the fins and even shake them like this, right? It's a very beautiful display. And they'll flare out their gills also, which are red, bright red. You can see the gills a little distended here. They'll flare out. You can do this also to a male beta without having a female around with a mirror. They see, they don't know it's another one in the mirror. And so they think it's another male that looks just like them. So they'll compete, but it's stressful. You should not keep them that way all the time because it stresses the fish into flaring out and acting aggressively, and they actually fight each other in real life. You put two male betas together and they'll start fighting each other. They'll lock on the jaw and rip the jaw off until, and then that other male can no longer eat and will eventually die. There are fights that are done in the Orient. This is actually very popular in certain towns and places. They gather and they do fights and they bet on the fish fights, just like the rooster fights, right? They're illegal because they're unethical, because it stresses the animals, and it's just for play and many times for gain, for betting. But that's what they do. Anyway, that's the human, because we tend to be the most aggressive species on Earth. No wonder other species run away from us. So you can see examples of male competition, female selection. It's all over the place. And there is, when we get to the human though, it gets very, very complicated, because for the human, we select mutually, all right? And so this is, for example, dancing, disco dancing. I'm a disco kid in the 70s. When I was your age, I used to go disco dancing, staying alive and all that. So it's a very complicated ritual that occurs between male and female, between men and women in the selecting process. But we can say that it's both. There's male competition, there's female selecting going on, and who knows who's going to win, but eventually couples do win out and they get to mate and procreate and have their children. So it's a very, very complicated thing when we get to male to human sexual selection, all right? But definitely goes on. In fact, it promotes an entire industry of the fashion industry, for example, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Finally, there is one last thing that is called runaway selection, which is also part of sexual selection. Okay, runaway selection is when the female becomes fixated on a particular characteristic of the male. And the more exotic that characteristic, that trait, that phenotype expresses, the more the female zeroes in on it, right? The classical example for birds, at least, is the peacock. The poor peacock, the female is fixated on this display. And it's actually not just the tail, because the tail seems to be, for us, the most exotic trait or phenotype, but it's actually the whole composite. And it's actually the composite from the front, all right, head on. Because what happens with head on is that this iridescent blue neck is framed with the background of the feathers. And all these look like eyes to us. Who knows what it looks like to the hen, but she's really attracted to that, right? And it's this yellow, it's this blue, iridescent blue cone that appears in front of the tail, including this little pinnacle of feathers that the male has on the crest here, right? Little tiny feathers that have it has no functional value. It's totally aesthetic, because those feathers, certainly they're not used for flight, and they're not even used for holding heat of the head, because they're out there like a crest, right? So it's totally, totally aesthetic, but they survive to this day. And you can see that this is a huge burden for the peacock to fly with that, for example, and to run away from prey. Who preys on the peacock? Naturally. I must tell you that where are they from? What's their niche and their habitat? India. They're from India originally. So who's their predator? The Bengal tiger. The Bengal tiger loves peacocks, okay? And the peacock so the tiger cannot run a peacock, even though the peacocks run very fast. We used to have a peacock here that I have to trap eventually and take down back to where they belong, which is Coconut Grove. But they're invasive. They're exotic. They're beautiful, but they're invasive. And anyway, staying with the story, this tail, this plumage has become so heavy on the peacock, they can still fly, but they can fly for a relative short distance. They become exhausted by trying to, they have feathers and everything, and the wings, and they fly, but it's exhaustive to carry that tail around because it's not very aerodynamic. All right, and so it makes the peacock tired soon, and they seldom fly. At some point going forward, maybe the progeny of peacocks may become flightless, like we know some animals that are flightless, some birds, right? But they're typically huge and they run very fast. And they live in territories where originally there were no carnivores. Ostrich, emu, rhea, those are all related. Moa, those are the rare names of them, but they're flightless. They have feather, they have wings, but they're degenerative. They cannot, the bird has become so massive that those wings cannot really make them fly. Anyway, the female is fixated on this display, and to boot, the male even shakes, fans the feathers when they're actually trying to mate, trying to conquer the female. They shake that whole plumage in the background. So it's a beautiful, exotic, well, maybe you can watch a brief video. Peacock display, just very briefly. Let's play forward, it's only 2 minutes. They're gonna shake. I don't know if it's gonna shake, but they shake it. There are the wings in the background. All right, so it's a back, there's a display from the back also. I don't know if, when the female appears, this guy goes and shakes that whole display. So it's just amazing, the beauty of it. Yeah, the cry is ugly, horrible. I don't know how that can attract anything, but it does. There's a little shaking there. I don't know. See, it's fanning out. It's looking for where the female is. The female may or may not be interested. Anyway, so it's the display as a whole. You get the picture. You can look at some of these later. Horrible. Stand it. All right, so that's runaway selection. It happens in many species, but not all species. For example, here's a species of beetles, and that's the male, right? This really has no function. It's actually a deterrence to the beetle because this is the male beetle, and these horns can get stuck. Well, the antlers, even for male mammals, those antlers and these horns, they can get stuck for prey, so they become easier prey for animals, right? But for some reason, the female is locked into those exotic horns. So the more exotic they become, the more the female locks into that display, all right? And that is called runaway selection. So you can see that on average, the male with the largest display, the most exotic display of whatever structure it is, phenotype, on average, will get to mate and pass on that trait until it just becomes too large to be viable, to be sustainable. And so what do you think is happening to the male chicks of the peacock? So the chick peacock, actually that's called the peacock and that's called the peahen, right? But the little male chicks tend to get selected out early because of the exotic display that they have to carry around, right? Okay, so that's runaway selection, which is a particular type of selection. It's with sexual selection. It doesn't occur in all species. In most species, it doesn't, but the end result is that they are these exotic structures that become super elaborate. Okay, that's it, folks. Questions, comments? So you see now what all this, it's all about selection. We do artificial selection, right? Because it's voluntarily geared toward some particular phenotype that we're interested in. Nature is doing natural selection, but natural selection as such assumes random mating, which seldom is the case out there, especially in animals, more in plants, right? But then, so the alternative is sexual selection, which Darwin tended to shun away from because didn't have a very good explanation for it. But we can see that with the two main events of male competition and female selection, female selecting the male, it can lead to eventually speciation because it's selecting on the variation or the variant which is most fit. On average, then the most fit genes will get to be passed on. Okay, folks, so that's it for this one. Unless there are any questions or comments, I'm going to stop the recording. Anything? No?